Hey everyone, welcome. My name is Alex Budd. I'm the Alliance organizer for the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance. Um, Thanks in advance to our speakers today. Welcome to our post-election debrief. What do the election results mean for forest and climate work and organizing and our movements moving forward? I'm going to try and keep it pretty brief just because there's a lot we can talk about. We're going to hear from David Perk about the Washington state elections, Michael Gaskill about things at the Oregon state level, and then Lauren is going to give an overview of what's happening and what we can expect at the federal level to the extent that we know what we can expect in advance at this point. Yeah, I just wanted to start by naming that I think a lot of us are feeling a lot of uncertainty and fear and grief and anger for our work and for our neighbors coming out of the election. And there's a lot that we don't know. And we're trying to use the space to get on the same page and as early steps in what will be a long process of figuring out how we come together and continue pushing things forward to make a better world possible for communities and our forests and climate. We're actually going to start with just some quick breakout groups just in pairs. For a couple of minutes, it's easy for these kinds of things to be just like a couple of us talking at everyone. And I know that's partly what folks are excited to hear from our really smart speakers today, but movements are made of all of us. So we're going to take a few minutes to connect with someone here on the call who you randomly end up in a breakout group with. Yeah, and just a space to share how you're feeling after the election, what fears or worries you have for our work around forest and climate or beyond that, and anything that you're finding helpful in keeping you grounded and motivated and focused and engaged, whether that's something you listened to or read or something a friend told you or just getting outside. And then we'll come back in a couple minutes and dive in. And we will have some time for questions at the end. So 20 breakout rooms. Here we go. No worries, Lloyd. I didn't know that you could ask for help or that would boot me into your group.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I lost my partner there. I mean, there was somebody there for a second. So I thought, I'm sure there's somebody else that same thing happened to. So maybe you can move me.
Yes, I can do that. This is room 5. I think I have to leave in order for it to show me this room. So I'm gonna hop out and I'll move you to
Okay,
another one.
that's fine.
Hey, Alex. There was no one in my breakout room. I can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry, thank you. It takes me a minute to get through the list and move all the people that are in a room alone to other rooms. So, and I know a few
Okay.
folks here, like Bodie and Lloyd, aren't in a place where they can talk or don't have a microphone.
Sure.
Uh, yeah, I'm curious. Thanks for sharing that, Bodie. Carol, how are you doing? Post election, kind of in the wake of it here. How are you feeling?
Surprisingly accepting. I mean, horrified, but I've been reading these Buddhist books that are well, I'm reading The Power of One by Eckhart Tolle and this other Buddhist focused book, and it's just helping me so much to just be in the present moment because
Yeah.
that's all that exists, right?
Yeah.
And then I read a really helpful article from Waging Nonviolence that I
Oh,
should share with our listserv about, it's 10 things to stay grounded and move forward now. And this guy works with people living under repressive regimes all over the globe, and it's very practical. Should have shared it before this event.
well, if you can send it to me, I'm gonna send out a like here are various like articles and like interviews that
Okay.
I've that have different. Some are like the finding motivation, and some are more like here's a more detailed breakdown of what this means for like the climate movement. Um,
Yeah.
so it'd be great to include that. Yeah, I think Lloyd, like you said, I just moved to a new house recently, and there's a hummingbird, and I don't know where they live, but every day they fly up to the window here and just kind of buzz around in front of my face. And yeah, things like that definitely help me stay grounded. And some of that longer term perspective that's really helpful. Um, yeah, I don't know, finding that balance between like appreciating the gravity and the seriousness and the stakes of it and the urgency of
Yeah.
the moment, and also not getting so caught up in that we lose sight of like the bigger picture and longer term. And in that sense, yeah, I think you said I don't feel surprised, but definitely some foreboding. Debbie and Bonnie, thanks for dropping in. We're just about to end some breakout groups that folks are all in, and we're going to come back and then dive into more of the analysis from our speakers today. But if any of y'all want to share just real briefly anything that you're feeling after the election, you know, particular worries or fears, or what's helping you stay grounded, we've got about a minute left. And if not, that's fine too.
Plenty of fears and concerns, but even more determined to extend our community. That's really my angle at this point. So I'm optimistic about doing that. And of course, we live in our Pacific Northwest bubble, but we're here, and I think that we could be some kind of a model as we have been in the past. So that's encouraging. I just can't be completely wiped out and too devastated to act. So I'm very motivated. Thank you for holding this webinar, this meeting.
Yeah, thanks for being here with us. Welcome back, everyone, for Breakout Rooms. If anyone heard something from the folks you were with that you felt like inspiring or you want to share, feel free to drop it in the chat. Otherwise, folks can mute themselves. I can go through and mute everyone manually, but that is a lot of clicking. So just so we don't have background noise, I think there's always a few folks who are having great conversations and really run that 60-second clock all the way to the end before coming back. I think that's everyone. Okay, welcome, folks. Yeah, as I mentioned, if you heard anything from the folks you're talking with that you want to share, that you found inspiring or worth uplifting, you can drop that in the chat. In the meantime, we're gonna move more into the like kind of policy analysis section here. We're gonna start with Michael Gaskill with Coast Range Association, talking about what the election results mean in Oregon at the Oregon state level for forest and climate policy starting next year. Michael?
I wasn't sure if you were like ready for me now. Okay. Great. Well, hey everybody. Alex, thanks for inviting me to do this. So obviously there are important things happening at the state level, but there's a lot of unknowns at this point in the legislative process, just like any year at this point before a legislative session, things are still taking shape. So I'll get into the landscape a little bit as I like in my limited understanding, but I'm also not an expert. I'm happy to share out like a document with some of the stuff I know, and if anybody does also know of other things happening at the state level we should be tracking, like I'm happy to try to, you know, like bring some of that together. Excuse me. But I'm gonna take a few moments to kind of level set a little bit, at least for me, just because it feels important. Uh, so first of all, I'll say that, you know, like everybody else, I'm super psyched about this election result, right? You know, it's just dream situation, I'm sure for all of us. Okay, so had to start with a little joke. So I'll caveat that there's a lot smarter people just in this room than me, and definitely elsewhere that have much better analyses than me. And I am going to say I'm here in a personal capacity because I want to be able to speak outside of the constraints of like representing a 501c3 organization. Uh, and lastly, forgive me if I'm about to just state things that we all already know, but like we're definitely entering an era that feels to me much more like a difference in kind and not degree, meaning like it's not uncharted territory that we're entering, which a lot of people have used that phrase. Like, I think we're entering like an entire different world where like the rules of gravity might not apply. So I think we need to be thinking of things really differently. And I think one of the worst things our movement could do right now is just put our heads down and keep working as if like the old rules apply, because they don't. Uh, we have, 2 months to prepare for a presidency that could range, in my opinion, from far worse than the first Trump administration to apocalyptic. I think those are legitimately the spectrum of possibilities. Um, I think that necessitates that we need to be taking a step back, uh, and reevaluating some core things rather than just business as usual organizing. I would love to see our movement interrogating, everything we think we know about our organizing strategy, engaging in some deep, really urgent strategic planning for a range of scenarios, working to cultivate as many different alliances as possible, and also reassessing how we engage in electoral politics. So, uh, thinking about how are we as a movement going to react and interact with all the coming crises, some of which may or may not feel completely relevant to our work. So, like for example, if, as has been widely reported, mass militarized deportations are going to be the top priority of the new administration, with associated political violence, and there's no meaningful guardrails to prevent that, we should assume that's going to happen and that it will be really brutal and will be the focus of most of the resistance organizing that happens in the early days. So like, how are we as organizations and our movement going to engage with that? And how are we going to center our strategy so that we're not just being buffeted by whatever comes our way, but that we have like a a sense of grounding, and are able to react, not just kind of mindlessly reacting. How does conservation movement strategy change when and if lawsuits become completely ineffective? And maybe Lauren will be touching on that later. I'm not sure, but I'd love to hope that planning around that's already happening on the electoral side. Andy Kerr recently wrote a blog post, which I'll link to if you all don't subscribe to Andy Kerr's newsletter. I don't always agree with everything he says, but super insightful and a person who's been in conservation world for a long time. And he wrote something I've been thinking about for a long time. Obviously, he more eloquent than I, but it's about partly how we are really hampered in our effectiveness by our C3 tax statuses for the people here representing organizations. And that, in my view, that's us not engaging or being able to engage in electoral politics is kind of like acting as if we live in a two-dimensional world. Like, I think we're really hampered by that, and would do well to re-examine that, et cetera, right? So there's a lot of considerations I think that we should be reevaluating beyond just like what I'm about to talk about, which is like the policy landscape, because that's, I think, all the state level policies were written in a different context, and we're entering a new world. So, with that said, on the state level, I'm not going to really talk about specific election results other than that to say 5 of our 6 congressional seats are now held by Democratic women, with a couple of women of color, and I don't know, I think that's cool in and of itself. And, we Democrats have total legislative control. They have a supermajority in the state Senate, not in the state House, so that hampers the ability to do certain meaningful things. But regardless, I think, we're entering an era where I think we have a reason to start demanding more from elected officials. That I think that we've been letting our Democratic party kind of off the hook, and we need to, demand and expect more of them in the new era. One of the reasons I'm a little hesitant to get too into state policy, Alex, please let me know when I have a 2-minute warning, by the way. I forgot to set my timer. So I'm hesitant to get too into state level policy, partly because I haven't been able to connect with a few key people. And I also, like I said, things are still taking shape, like the Oregon Conservation Network, which is kind of an alliance of different NGOs, is still setting their priorities, et cetera, et cetera. But I haven't seen anything out there that, like, even met the moment before this one, let alone the moment we're coming into. So, we have 2 months until the 2025 legislative session starts on the 21st of January. And, I would really like to see a reevaluation of what legislative priorities should be. I mean, some things, are very important, even if they don't feel like the number one thing at the moment, but we just need to reevaluate, I think, the whole suite of how we're approaching politics and organizing. So with that said, OLCV is obviously one of the savvier organizations that pushes bills. And so I would suggest folks look out to see what they are prioritizing, because that will end up being the priority of the Environmental Caucus to a large degree. Also the Oregon Conservation Network, or OCN. So they haven't yet set their legislative priorities. I've heard from OLCV that the climate protection program will be a place of defense. So keep an eye on that. I also heard from them and from Representative Mark Gamba that there's going to be a big push on focusing on like grid transmission issues, streamlining ways to get more transmission online, which frankly could be kind of a divisive issue in the environmental and conservation community, but something to be looking at. There's definitely going to be multiple wildfire funding bills. Those, again, have yet to take shape. Also, TBD is what the next bite at the timber tax apple is going to look like. But that, apple is there, and people are going to be biting at it. And to extend the metaphor there, the fight could be pretty juicy this session. I think that is definitely an area to be looking at, and could or could not be intertwined with the wildfire funding. So someone I've spoken with who's shopping around a number of interesting legislative concepts is Casey Kula at Oregon Wild, relating to things like making it easier for people to do like forest conservation tax deferrals instead of having to practice industrial timberland forestry on their land in order to get tax referrals. There's some policy and legislative concept around strengthening environmental justice and Oregon's administration of the Clean Water Act. Stuff folks working on it on the policy side, like a habitat conservation plan for private lands coming out of the forest accords. Again, though, not a lot that I am seeing that really meets the moment that we would even be in if like the election had gone as well as it possibly could have. So, again, I go back to, I think that we as a movement need to be thinking of this moment that we're coming into as a change in kind, not degree. Our organizing strategies and made out of necessity look very different, and the more that we kind of start planning for that now, the better. Alex, you direct messaged me to, okay, so I'm over time now, Alex? Is that what
Yeah, that seemed like you were kind of winding down to a natural stopping place there.
Okay, so that's my spiel. And I could maybe say a couple more personal words later in the podcast or in the broadcast. Oh, that was what I was going to say. Alex and Brenna were recently on the Coast Range Radio podcast, and they were fantastic, and they offered wonderful insights. And so I'd encourage folks to find the Coast Range Radio on podcast apps.
I put the link in the chat, and it'll be included in the list of resources and links and things that go out with the recording of this email. Thanks so much, Michael. I'm going to keep us moving, and we're going to come back for questions after we get through our speakers. So I'm going to pass it over to David to talk about Washington.
Hey, everybody. So, Michael, great words. I will admit that I prepared by thinking of all the things that went down in Washington and not so much by thinking of looking ahead. So sort of reacting to the way that you were framing things, I would say at a very high level, Washington stayed blue, maybe got a little bit bluer. We've got a bunch of executive change. Those people say that they're going to protect us. And I also think that I think Washington State is essentially defended from federal intrusion, but that's just a starting point. So setting that big overview aside, I'm going to kind of quickly run down through the various things that were on the ballot, starting with our initiatives. So we had some of you who are familiar with Washington State might remember the name Tim Eyman. He was our previous initiative magnate. He is in the rearview mirror off the stage, but there's a new guy, a Republican hedge fund manager who moved to Washington to avoid income tax. He used a clever flood the zone strategy, submitting 6 initiatives to the state legislature. They accepted 3 of them, the social ones. I'm not going to go into details. And they let the 3 fiscal ones go to the ballot. That galvanized a great deal of resistance. Big money came into play from large environmental groups and state billionaires, and they massively outspent the initiatives in the general campaign, and they all failed. That means that Washington's Cap and Trade Climate Commitment Act will continue, and that also means it'll continue to seek to link with California and Quebec. So that is funding that will not go away. There was one additional late arriving initiative that did not go through the legislature. It, broadly speaking, was an effort to preserve and embed the use of fossil gas in buildings and the built environment and roll back building code changes. That passed by about 3%, but it's viewed as being so overly broad that it will see a legal challenge. And so fingers crossed that will be defeated. Going to the federal level, Washington State went blue, and the notable thing here is that Clallam County, the most upper left county in the lower 48, lost its 18-year bellwether status by breaking from the Electoral College by going with Kamala Harris, as did the state overall. So people are going to be looking around in 4 years for another bellwether. In Congress, the senator who was up for re-election just cruised to victory easily. That was Maria Cantwell. In the House, the rural Democrat Marie Gluesenkamp Perez won her rematch with her MAGA opponent, so we held that blue seat in the House. There was an open seat that stayed blue with a new candidate stepping in, Emily Randall. And then just as a kind of a note on the relationship, the Republican politics, the non-MAGA Republican in the House who voted for Trump's impeachment survived re-election. So he's still around, Dan Newhouse. In regards to statewide offices, lots of change, essentially coming from the top down. Our three-term climate governor, Jay Inslee, did not seek a fourth term. Therefore, our attorney general, long expected to run for the seat, ran for it, won it. Bob Ferguson, you folks might remember him as the guy who sued Trump about 99 times. So he is pledging to defend the state against the federal government. There's also then a new attorney general who also has federal experience from having been a state prosecutor. So he's probably one endorsement of him from our Alternative Weekly said he will be well suited for defending. So he's there. We also have a new insurance commissioner. Speaking about Republican politics, this was the first electoral cycle where the MAGA crowd finally captured the state GOP party. As a result, the primaries had both MAGA and non-MAGA Republicans. That kind of was interesting, but the ones that moved through were largely non-MAGA and also then failed in their general elections, which brings us to the lands commissioner race. Washington State is only one of 5 states that elects a lands commissioner. I've got the other ones for anyone who wants to win at trivia contests. The lands commissioner role manages about 44% of the state. That includes 2 million acres of forests, half of which have habitat conservation plans. I will say that a particular candidate, Dave Upthegrove, currently a member of the King County Council. That's the council that the county that includes Seattle, so the leftmost and most populated. He indicated interest in running for the open seat of lands commissioner, and members of our working group or people adjacent to our working group courted him, and he adopted an issue that we have been pursuing for the last 3 years, legacy forests. Those are a activist-defined classification of state forests that are structurally complex and carbon dense. There's only about 80,000 acres of them. And the current commissioner has been very active selling them off in timber sales. He adopted that as a plank in his platform and promising to preserve them, quote, on day one, unquote. We had a very crowded primary with 2 Republicans, 5 Democrats. It came down to a hand recount of 1.9 million ballots in 39 counties, and our guy, Upthegrove, won by 49 votes, state record. A bunch of our folks and related people helped out with the ballot chasing and curing, and he knows that we helped. So we feel somewhat confident that we have a bit of his ear. However, in the general election, which he did win 52 to 46%, his opponent raised our particular issue, legacy forests, and attacked him viciously on it. That caused the issue to be elevated. The media had to learn to talk about it, at least in summary. And the timber industry is going to be really poised to sue as soon as he starts to do anything when he gets in. So we're in this very interesting position of moving into a very new situation with someone who is sympathetic and wants to do the right thing. And the question will be, how can we best support him to do that? One other note on a statewide race, Washington's state forests are harvested, I think like Oregon's, for the purpose of funding things like schools. The largest recipient of that money, the superintendent of public instruction, has become an ally saying, this isn't the right way to raise money. It's a very small part of our budget. He won re-election. So, and I also have the impression that our new governor is sympathetic to preserving mature forests. So we potentially have 3 elected officials who might be interested in getting something done to protect those particular trees. In the legislature, we had a lot of we had some people leave. We have new people coming in. The Democrats did not get a supermajority in the House, but they now have one in the Senate. There was a redistricting around the city of Yakima that did not lead to new Democratic seats. That's super interesting for some folks. There will be new chairs for the natural resource committees in both chambers. And as there will still be that Climate Commitment Act money, but as one person put it to me, there will be a lack of veteran legislators. There's going to be a bunch of unfamiliar new people. Expect chaos, and there will be a budget deficit, so we have to move into a defensive posture. So therefore, expect bad actors to take advantage. So that is sort of the high level legislative perspective. And now we've got probably a bunch of defense and protection for all kinds of things related to the federal government, including substitute funding. So there you go. I think that's what went down in Washington, and I, on a local level, feel somewhat hopeful.
Thanks, David. Speaking of playing defense, we're going to next pass it over to Lauren Anderson with Oregon Wildland Climate Forest Campaign to talk about the federal level.
Thank you, Alex. Hi, folks. My name is Lauren. I'm the Climate Forest Program Manager with Oregon Wild, and I also sit on the planning group for the Climate Forest Coalition. And Climate Forest Coalition has been, up until this point, focused on advocating for a rule to protect mature and old growth forests. My presentation is going to be a little bit different today. I'm going to walk through some specific pieces or actions that are coming up. And I'm going to talk about the Congressional Review Act, which is a piece of legislation that passed in the 1990s. And the Congressional Review Act, I'm sure a few folks have heard about before, but this particular law is really problematic when you are trying to get federal regulations over the finish line in the last days of an administration. So the way the CRA works is that Congress can roll back and revoke any regulation that has been finalized in the last 60 legislative days of the previous administration. So the House has not been called yet in Congress, but it's looking very, very likely that Republicans will control the House and the Senate and the White House. And so, this goes without saying, but that is absolutely the worst case scenario. And so having those 3 houses controlled by Republicans increases the risk of a CRA exponentially. The CRA hasn't been used really extensively in the past until the last Trump administration. I believe the CRA has been used on about 20 rules and regulations overall. And 16 of those times were during the last Trump administration. So they are big fans of it and using it to gut previous rules and regulations. Um, One of the components of the Congressional Review Act that is the most problematic is that in addition to fully revoking the regulation that made it over the finish line, it also prohibits that agency from ever doing a similar regulation again in the future, which is a big problem, especially when you're looking at these massive national forest policies like the nationwide old growth amendment. If they were to roll back the National Old Growth Amendment under the CRA, that would basically block the Forest Service from ever doing a policy on mature and old growth forests again. So it's a big deal. It's a huge risk. And it applies indefinitely into the future. So the Congressional Review Act basically makes it so that there are a number of regulations, not just the NOGA, but other regulations that the Biden administration is trying to finalize that will likely be shelved and not finalized going forward because the risk under the CRA is too high. So I think that is a good starting point to kind of like set the stage and let people know that as we enter this new era, we are facing some pretty serious challenges. On the bright side, though, the draft environmental impact statement of the National Old Growth Amendment wasn't particularly impressive, as many of you know. It did not go as far as we wanted on old growth protections, and it did not include mature forests at all. So, having that piece of policy shelved is pretty heartbreaking. We were hoping to get some additional pieces out of it that maybe prohibited commercial use of old growth, which would have been a huge win. There were a lot of components of it that would have set the stage for a future policy, which would have been promising. But overall, not finalizing that policy going forward, I think, is probably our best case scenario. So that's the Congressional Review Act and an update on the National Old Growth Amendment and where things stand. The Biden administration has not yet shelved the NOGA, it will be their call to decide what next steps are. But I think a lot of folks who have been working on this issue are hopeful that it will not be finalized at this point. The other thing I want to touch base on with this group is that we do have a couple more months of this Congress before the next Congress starts. There is a lot that can happen during the lame duck session. It's very common for going into an election, especially a close election, for Congress to be like, oh, we're going to deal with that after the election, which in this case ended up being several very big pieces of legislation that got punted to the lame duck session. And that includes appropriations, NDAA, which is the National Defense Authorization Act, the Farm Bill, which is a huge piece of legislation that needs to be reauthorized every 5 years, and a potential public lands package coming together. And the two pieces of legislation that we're watching most closely going forward are that public lands package. There are a number of priorities that folks have been advocating for decades that could potentially make it over the finish line in that package, which is incredibly exciting. But there's also a bill that I think a number of folks are familiar with called the Fix Our Forests Act. And it sounds pretty harmless, but this forest management bill is not harmless. It has a number of really problematic components that would basically roll back our bedrock environmental laws. So it takes a swing at the Endangered Species Act. It takes a swing at NEPA and public engagement, which is a really big problem for a number of our groups. It expands categorical exclusions on public lands for logging projects to the size of like 10 square miles that they can go out and just decimate forests. So it sounds like a harmless piece of legislation. It's framed around the wildfire crisis and addressing the wildfire crisis, but it is a horrible bill. And there is a real risk that it makes it into a public lands package going forward. And that's heartbreaking because if it does make it in, a number of groups that have been advocating for these wilderness bills, wild and scenic rivers, all of these great conservation initiatives would probably need to oppose a public lands package with its inclusion because it is that bad. And it does set the stage for, a pretty big attack on bedrock environmental laws. So that is one thing we're going to be paying very close attention to. And one action folks can take is asking their members of Congress to oppose the inclusion of Fix Our Forests Act in any public lands package. The other piece is the Farm Bill. So the Farm Bill has passed the House, and because the House had a lot of anti-conservation interests in it at the time, there are similar provisions in the Farm Bill. So for the Farm Bill, the action is to call on your senators and ask them to pass a clean Farm Bill without any of the bad environmental riders. And I don't believe the environmental riders in the Farm Bill all go quite as far as Fix Our Forest Act, but they definitely undermine Endangered Species Act and NEPA and public engagement. And they also gut funding for a lot of natural climate solutions funding through the Farm Bill. So that is another big one to keep an eye on. So looking ahead, there are other big conservation policies moving forward at this time. Northwest Forest Plan is one of those. So an update on timing for the Northwest Forest Plan. The latest intel I have, and other folks might have more recent intel, is that the draft environmental impact statement is due to come out this Friday. So 3 days. And the comment period for the Northwest Forest Plan would be 120 days. So that would take it squarely into the Trump administration to finalize the Northwest Forest Plan, which is probably not great. So the draft environmental impact statement as written, we haven't seen a draft yet. We don't know what the Forest Service is going to come out with, but there's really nothing that prevents the Trump administration and their industry folks who are whispering in their ear all the things that they want them to do to influence that final outcome. And beyond influencing it, they could even go so far as to issue a supplemental environmental impact statement after the fact that even takes revisions far further than the draft environmental impact statement that we see. So, what comes next is to be determined, but I think it's safe to say that there is going to need to be a pretty strong defense effort around federal public lands going forward. So that is updates on nationwide old growth amendment, lame duck session, and Northwest Forest Plan. I guess a couple of closing thoughts on this, and Alex, I'm not sure how much time I have. I can speed up too.
You're doing great.
Cool. So some of my takeaways from this isn't speaking for Oregon Wild, but Trump administration, they had something like 70 million votes across the country, and that's a lot of Americans, and it's pretty alarming and pretty stressful for a lot of reasons. But I do not believe that every person that voted for that administration is giving them social license to gut environmental laws or clean water, clean air, all of these values we hold closely. And I've seen, and even press statements from the folks that he's nominating to his cabinet, them being clear that no, we're gonna, cut costs and bring gas prices down, and we're gonna do all these things. And then they're and we're gonna do this while holding the highest environmental standards and ensuring the protections stay for clean water and clean air. And they're saying that. So they clearly know that they don't have the social license. And so for us going forward, I think it's going to be important for us to hold them to that and elevate those stories and make it clear that the public is not with them on attacking our environment or our forests. And so that brings us back to telling stories, elevating issues at the local level. I know a lot of folks on this call do that already, but I think it's going to be more important going forward and holding the line on some of these protections that we have. I think we're going to have an opportunity to build up our champs in Congress on these issues. The wildfire issue has just been such a challenge for breaking through and getting congressional support on mature and old growth forest protections. They're yeah, we support saving old growth, but wildfires number one all the way. And I think that it's very likely that we're going to see a lot of attacks on environmental laws in the frame of addressing the wildfire crisis going forward. And so I think there's going to be room to educate our members of Congress on these issues and build up champs going forward, because we are going to need them. And the next election for Congress, that's 2 years. So that's holding the line for 2 years and doing that education and outreach for 2 years with the hope that midterms go well. The bureaucracy in the Forest Service, which was so much fun to deal with while trying to move forward with the National Old Growth Amendment, may work in our favor in some ways going forward, because they don't like change. Federal agencies hate change, any shift in policy. They don't want to do it. They want to keep doing what they've been doing. And so, I think that that can work in our favor going forward, and identifying allies within federal agencies and building those relationships, I think, is also going to be important going forward. It's not to say everyone in those federal agencies is going to be on our side. That is not the case, but I do think that their reluctance to do transformational change will help us going forward. Folks on this call do a lot of volunteering, ground truthing, building up community knowledge and education. All of this is going to be really important going forward. It's good to remember that on this mature and old growth and climate forest effort, we got really far. Like, President Biden issued his executive order on mature and old growth forests like 1 year in. That was pretty impressive. It caught many of us, even who work closely on these issues, by surprise. And we almost got the nationwide old growth amendment over the finish line. And granted, we wouldn't have known what the final would have looked like. And it definitely would not have gone as far as we wanted, but still getting a policy of that size that the agency's never done before over the finish line in and of itself, and having all that research and the administrative record and all of the statements agency staff have made about climate and forests, we've swung the pendulum quite far. We're entering into an era where it's going to swing back, and it's going to be really, there's no sugarcoating it. It's going to be really rough for the next 4 years. But the hope is that we can set things up for when that pendulum swings back. After these next 4 years, we're going to take it so much further than we did this time. And so I hope that folks can keep their eye on that going forward. And that's it for me.
Thanks so much, Lauren. If folks have questions, I want to drop them in the chat. Okay. We might run a little bit over if folks have to leave sharply at 1. Obviously, that's fine. I believe Lauren and Michael and David all mentioned that they could stay on a little bit past 1 if we go late. So, Tyler?
Yeah, Lauren, you mentioned a couple of actions we can take in contacting federal reps. Can you send those out to the Alliance that we can then send out to our networks?
Yes, and I have some links I can drop in the chat too. I'll drop a link that's more background on the Congressional Review Act for people who want to educate themselves on this. I'm going to drop a link to a bill that's circulating for environmental groups right now on the Farm Bill and the bad provisions in the Farm Bill. Even if you're an individual, not an organization, you can still follow up with your members of Congress and email them about this. And then another piece on the Fix Our Forests Act. This is a letter that was submitted over the summer, but it does a deep dive into all of the really serious problems with Fix Our Forests. So just dropped all those links in.
Thanks, Lauren. And we'll be doing, I'll be sending out all the links and things that folks have shared along with the recording after the fact. Carol, you had a question for Mike. It looks like I missed one thing. What did you say might be linked to wildfire funding bills in the Oregon legislative session?
Oh, yeah. So last session, there was kind of an intertwined fight around wildfire funding and timber taxation, with our now state treasurer trying to sort of give a giveaway to the timber companies in terms of the fact that we subsidize, ODF subsidizes fire response on industrial timberlands, which means that we subsidize Weyerhaeuser's fire response. There are some early indications that our state treasurer will be better in her treasurer role than she was as a state senator. But that's just the thing that was intertwined, is that the timber taxation issue of whether they should pay their fair share or whether they should uh, uh, not pay basically anything as they currently are. So I think that'll be intertwined with wildfire.
Thank you.
Jack, did you have a question about the Forest Service budget for Lauren?
Yes, at the stewardship meeting this week, I believe, maybe it was last week. And Chandra, I don't think you were there. The supervisor said that as of this moment, she has no budget or money beyond income from sales. And then discussed reductions in staffing and operations that I thought, well, it took me all by surprise. Is this something that happened after October as we got into the new fiscal year? What's going on?
The Forest Service is in an extreme budget crisis right now. They are in a lot of trouble. Their budgets are running down and they don't have money. So it's creating a pretty stressful situation for the agency as a whole right now. I'm sure that will be used as an excuse by the incoming administration for them to increase logging in order to pay for their existence. So the appropriations is coming up during the lame duck session. So having conversations with your members of Congress about what the options are for ensuring the agency has the money it needs so that it does not have to turn to logging to generate revenue, I think will be a good action to take.
Thank you.
Are there any Republican members of Congress, Lauren, that you see being movable on old growth protection? Or are they all likely to toe the party line? Or the Trump line, I guess. Question. There's representatives and senators, but
yeah. I don't know. I don't see any Republicans taking a stand on the mature and old growth issue. I don't think that's very likely. But I know that there are a number of Republican, like again, there is no social license to log old growth trees anymore. So I think that it's good to Republicans will make public statements of obviously we should protect the old growth or not cut old growth anymore. We don't cut old growth, so there's no need for protections. That's kind of the spiel. But when it comes to actually taking additional actions, I don't know if we've really seen much in the way of that yet. And no one comes to mind for me of being a Republican champion on old growth conservation.
Just to jump in real quick. Yeah, I think probably our bigger issue there is Democrats going the other way and co-signing the bad legislation coming in the interest of showing their bipartisanship or whatever, bullshit. We should definitely be looking at Val Hoyle and making sure that she doesn't try to use this as an opportunity to demonstrate some weird bipartisanship.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely right. Ensuring that we have Democrats that are absolute champions on taking a stand for mature and old growth forests, I think is going to be really important going forward. Val Hoyle and Salinas voted against the Fix Our Forests Act when it came up for a vote in the House, which was good. But that was not an easy vote for them to take, which is bad. So I think that hearing from other people that they support stronger forest protections is very helpful.
anyone have other questions for speakers before we wind down? Obviously, I'm sure we'll all have lots of questions for the next year at least. Okay. Well, there's always the Alliance listserv and the discussion listserv. Feel free to reach out to others. I guess I'll just share as we wind down a few things kind of at another level from some of the more climate and other movement stuff that I've been tracking in the wake of the election, and just kind of a few takeaways from that. it's important to remember that we're stronger together. There will be attempts to divide and conquer our movement and all movements and, split people against each other. I've already seen that in some organizing spaces just in the last week. And that's important to remember that and to, resist that. And on the same token, I think we can expect the next few years to feel like a constant series of crises. And we'll be battling with shorter attention spans and people feeling the need to triage competing issues that all feel vital. And so with that in mind, building broader coalitions beyond our usual allies, I think is going to be really important for both for defense and for when we're able to, push good things forward, and finding those opportunities to push new policies and ideas forward, even if it's at the local or state level, is really important because those will be the seeds when there's moments of greater political possibility. Something else to flag, we don't know quite how extensively they're going to go in this direction, but there's been a lot. I think we can expect more political repression. Vance has talked about shutting down philanthropic foundations, mostly big ones like Gates and Ford and Tides Foundation. But if that starts to happen, it seems likely that at least some smaller foundations will start self-policing the kinds of things that they fund and support potentially. There's also currently a bill in Congress that would allow the Treasury Secretary to shut down nonprofits and revoke their 501c3 status if the Treasury Secretary unilaterally decides they support terrorism and there's no limitations or definition of what terrorism is or recourse. So that's like another short-term thing if you're reaching out to members of Congress to push back on. And in general, just needing to go out of our way as much as we can to, show up in solidarity with those who are targeted more directly, partly because it's one of, a core guiding principle of the Forest Climate Alliance that we're all on board with when we came together, and also just because even if we and our movements aren't initially targeted with more intense repression, we know that sooner or later those tools get used against everyone. And we want there to be as many people to show up and have our backs when and if that happens. And the best way to do that is to show up and have other folks' backs, even if those struggles aren't as directly connected to the work that we're doing. And then just a final plug that, the far right has won by speaking to class and cultural resentments, and that capitalist story of progress and prosperity in the American dream no longer feeling real to people anymore. Climate change and breakdown is locking in that. And that's going to continue to be central to politics and policy moving forward. And we're going to need to find ways to address that and articulate a vision of forest and climate defense that feels meaningful rather than threatening or condescending to working class and rural and timber dependent communities. That's not a very happy note to end on. Thanks everyone for being here. If you have questions and are on the listserv, feel free to pop them out to others or follow up with me and I can pass them along to our speakers. And we'll be sending out the recording and notes and links to all the great resources and actions and things that folks have shared.
I have one note to end on.
Okay.
So it's the same. I said this in like the introduction to that podcast I did with Alex and Brenna, but this quote it's a misquote, but it just helps me think about organizing in this time. It's just like our task is not to move the boulder, our task is to push. And if we push together, there's a better chance of us actually moving the boulder, but the point is not to move it, it's to make the effort to push. So that's my attempt at a hopeful note for us to end on.
Great. Thanks everyone for being here. We'll see you soon.